All right, everyone, it's time to decide what race Jesus was, because apparently, the race of a person who, and I say supposedly lived and died, 2,000 years ago, has a lot of modern relevance within politics for some reason now, because BLM hates white Jesus and thinks that he was, I don't know, from sub-Saharan Africa, I guess. It's funny because they explain it by saying that white Jesus is an expression of supremacism and racial intolerance. But there are people who attempt to depict Jesus as East Asian or black, which he clearly was not as well. And those, of course, BLM has no problem with them. I think they promote the idea that Jesus was like Yaqub. But let's analyze this from a historical perspective. Now, again, arguing technically, pardon the pun, devil's advocate, because there may not have been a historical Jesus. My opinion is that the central figure, of course, was a human being. I acknowledge the likelihood that there was a central figure, but I think that most of these stories about him are metaphor. Much of it is mystic metaphor, actually, from the Essene background. Some of it even possibly broadly Zoroastrian in form. Of course, Judaism was influenced heavily by Babylon and similar groups, the ancient Egyptians to some extent. This is openly admitted to in Victorian literature. If you read the new shit, they don't admit to it at all. They fall into two groups, skeptics who say there was no Jesus, and religious scholars who say, well, Jesus was obviously God's son, and everything the Bible says is 100% true, accurate, and non-metaphorical. I reject these arguments. But let's assume that there was a historical figure, just for the sake of our analysis. This figure, in broad ethnic terms, would resemble people from the modern-day Levant region, the native people of that region. The Syriac people come to mind. Could have been further admixture. Of course, we're assuming that Joseph is a member of this Levant-based tribe that had evolved in this particular region for some thousands of years. The appearance, the physical characteristics of Jesus would not be black. They also would not be a blonde-haired, blue-eyed European like a Swede or something. That is an appropriation of this figure and the Europeanization of it in order to fit in more close. So like you get an Irish Jesus, you get a very Germanic-looking Jesus. You have a darker-haired Jesus in Italy or something that, oddly enough, looks slightly like me. I think I resemble Judas a little bit more, though, sometimes. This individual would have had light, but not pale skin, most likely. Probably would have had dark hair, although it may not have been particularly black, chestnut brown or something. Probably would have had dark eyes, but although not necessarily, there are also green-eyed groups that live within that region as well. There are people with blue eyes. It's just not as common. It's a possibility, and he could have had hazel eyes. He could have gray eyes. It probably would have been intermediate in stature. Just follow the bell curve. He probably was not 7 feet tall. He probably wasn't a midget. He's always depicted as very skinny, although, it's probably likely he would have been rather lean. People back then, these days people suffer from too much food. Back then, until about 100 years ago, most people suffered from famine periodically. As a member of the working class, neither a slave peasant at the lowest end nor certainly wealthy, as someone who had a family that owned an actual business, had a shop, did what would be considered, reasonably skilled but not highly skilled work, probably would have had, ironically, what amounts in those days to a roughly lower middle class existence, without any political power or anything. So probably would have been lean, and this is sort of, the proper depiction of this individual. Would have looked broadly Levantine in nature. It's basically what it would have been. Now, of course, some people say, well, no, actually Joseph was black. That's why they fled to Egypt, actually, when there was the persecution. They fled there because they felt welcome or something. That's probably not true, and you've got to understand that the Egyptians, by and large, again, have similar characteristics. There are black Egyptians. By and large, that's an imported genetic group from further south, from what was then Nubia, from what's now the modern-day Sudan. Again, this admixture under Roman occupation would have been much more common, but prior to that, in the days of it as an empire, would have been uncommon. There would have been distinct groups, a lot of it related to slavery and servitude and things like that. It's like when they say that the Jews were slaves in Egypt. That's not technically the case. The Jews sold themselves into temporary servitude due to a widespread famine. What happened in Egypt was that if you were willing to do work on the pyramids or whatever, you got rations. And so at least you didn't starve, because the Egyptians had usually large crop surpluses because they had the Nile Delta, a lot of food grown there. They had grain silos, they had storage methods, and so you wouldn't starve. And so as long as you were willing to work hard, you wouldn't starve. But people worked hard anyway, whether they were starving or not. It was better to go to Egypt than to allow most of your tribe to die. The Jews probably weren't the only tribe, by the way, doing this in Egypt. That excess manpower did contribute to the pyramids. Of course, it wasn't largely done by slaves. Most of it was the Egyptians themselves. The lower classes would have clamored in the off-season when they had given 90% of their grain to storage in silos. They then go and they work in the off-season. There's nothing to do in their field. They go and they cart rocks around. If they're more skilled, they cut the rocks, or they carved hieroglyphics or something like that. By the way, the obsession with what race this character is, I don't quite understand. Some of these people aren't even Christian. A lot of these, like what religion is Sean King? I don't know. He probably has his own weird views. He probably has some totally ethno-nationalistic religion in mind, like sort of a Kwanzaa thing, which is literally an ethno-nationalistic modern religion. It's sort of like Wicca. Wicca was largely, responsibly created by an individual who just wanted to watch boobies. It has nothing to do with ancient traditions. Loosely, it's fun. Wicca can be a fun thing, and hedge Wicca, I think, is reasonably wise, and there's some historicity behind certain parts of it, but by and large, it's not a historical, antiquated religion. There never was an actual European witch cult. That's sort of the I'm a blood witch. My ancestors in Italy used to practice witchcraft with pins and lemons. No, they didn't. That was a Victorian creation. But when we're talking about history, it gets murky. Because again, before the relatively modern period, you didn't have photography and moving film and stuff like that could document things more objectively. Hell, well into the modern period, and now you're in the post-truth period where they have deep fakes. When are we going to get a deep-faked Abraham Lincoln film of him, whipping his cock out or something like that? I expect something like that eventually to happen. People can be hoodwinked by stuff. It's like UFO searching. As soon as commercial drones became a thing, the search for UFOs fundamentally ended. Somebody sent me a video the other day of weird lights over some city. I'm like, oh, it's a group of drones in the most literal sense. In fact, if you have, if you have the right computer program and a couple of commercial drones, you can do the same thing. If you have a drone and you put like a balsam wood scaffold and some tinfoil over it and some blinking LEDs, you could probably convince people it was a UFO. It probably wouldn't even be that hard. And by the way, when you take film of it, as long as you built it properly, you know what a UFO, a flying saucer, should look like or something like that, they wouldn't even be able to declare that the film was doctored. They would think it was authentic or something. How many times, by the way, has that happened? Maybe the Phoenix lights were just a swarm of drones way back then that were being tested by the U.S. government. How do we know that they weren't? I know I'm getting way off track. But yeah, what race was Jesus? Broadly from the Levant. Would have had light-ish characteristics, but probably dark hair, probably dark eyes, and would have appeared deeply tanned. That's what he probably would have looked like. And yeah, he probably was thin, but he probably wasn't, sometimes they depict Jesus being like 6'6" or something like that. That's largely for the reasons of differentiating him from his surroundings. Make him look bigger to make him more central. It's sort of an artistic, stylistic depiction. That's what he would have looked like, most likely. I like that one picture that they have where they purposely make Jesus look like very rugged. It's not entirely clear that he would have looked that way, because you have to understand that he left the carpentry behind to go and be basically a philosopher, a teacher. If he was involved in that behavior more often than not, he probably was not wind-blasted and rugged. He probably would have been a little bit more refined looking. But yeah, I mean, the idea that he had like a perfect skin and flowing hair. No, he probably didn't have long hair. He probably kept it short. Most people, unless you were in the upper classes or you were clerical in nature, your hair would have usually been short, or even he might have been bald. He might have shaved his head. Would have been funny. You get a picture of Jesus, it's like a bald midget or something like that. That's about all. Peace out.